As awesome as brand new video games are, it's nice on occasion to revisit an old adventure we hold close. Whether it be something as simple as a straight port or a shined up remaster, it's always great to be able to jump back into a classic title on modern hardware. However, sometimes devs want to do more, maybe expand the story, fix up flawed design elements, or even mold the game into a completely new structure. And that's when people really start talking. So, remakes. There's certainly no shortage of them in the game industry today. Hell, if anything, they're starting to increase, what with the rising development costs and the general time period of the Nintendo Switch being on its way out, thus it's easier to put out remakes for a console in its twilight. And though it may not seem like it to a general outsider, remakes can actually be a very controversial topic in gaming circles. While I will say video games are probably the most positively received medium when it comes to remakes, as it seems like nowadays if you hear a remake of a movie or a TV show is happening, the response is usually a resounding but there is a not insignificant portion of the public who doesn't take kindly to video game remakes, with the most common critiques often being that they're lazy/uncreative by reusing old content, and that the resources would be better off going towards brand new titles. Now, speaking personally, I'm not one of these people. I find remakes great, in fact, and they're very often some of my most highly anticipated games every year. Which could be more a commentary on the endless pipeline of slop coming out of like 70% of the industry nowadays, but we don't have to think about that right now. Remakes to me hold so much potential whenever they come around. They can do things as simple as making a previously very inaccessible game widely available to the public, hi Thousand Year Door, to something as huge as reworking and improving a previously deeply flawed title into the true gem it always had the potential to be. Or hell, nowadays it could even go the reimagining route and make major story-sweeping changes that practically turn it into an all-new experience for both newcomers and longtime fans. Although with that last statement, I did evoke the dreaded word that causes certain people to have a conniption fit. Change. This is perhaps the second most common form of backlash behind the lazy argument whenever a new remake drops. You get fans of the original work being incredibly vocal about any sort of changes the remake has. From aspects as big as all new gameplay elements to something as minor as the lighting of a scene being slightly altered. The latter of which surprisingly kicks people off, like, oh no, my sun rays bounce off the characters differently than they did 20 years ago, but buddy, put the magnifying glass down, you're not writing your college thesis on this. These types of observations existed for a long time, but within the past year or so, it's since been boiled down to a specific term: soul versus soulless. A phrase that now gets thrown around damn near every time a remake comes around, and avid fans of the original see the most minute differences. Whether it be a Twitter thread complaining about screenshot differences or an hour-plus long video essay going off on one. Although I am making my own video on this topic, so who am I to judge, I guess. Now, in some regard, I do understand this sentiment. If you hold a piece of media very close to your heart, seeing changes made to it could get under your skin. And I will in no way act like there haven't been remakes that actively damage the game in question.
What the hell is this?
But I also do think this general attitude has been vastly overblown by a number of people, who will now start kicking and screaming at any alterations to the original work and either pay no mind to / act as though that completely disregards any positive improvements or additions a remake brings forward. Now, not all remakes are the same in terms of what they make changes to, so which ones seem to kick up the storm the most? Generally, from my own observations, it's usually the remakes that land in the middle of the spectrum of change that cause the most arguing, as remakes with barely any differences are so straightforward there's little to pick apart, and remakes that damn near alter the entire game have people look at it more on its own merits due to just how different it is. The recent Mario RPG remakes and the FF7 remake saga are perfect examples of these. The Mario RPG and Thousand Year Door remakes are almost one-to-one, where really the only things people may argue about is the remixed music versus the original soundtrack and maybe the graphics. While the FF7 remake saga is so starkly different from the original in visuals, gameplay structure, and even story that people aren't as immediate to chastise it over the changes due to being so upfront about it. So when you get games that both stay faithful in some aspects while also making alterations in others, you get the aforementioned outcry. That leads into the real meat of this video, as there are two remakes in particular I wanted to delve into regarding the Soulless argument and how undeserving I feel it is for the both of them. The first of which being
Resident Evil 4.
Now, Resident Evil 4 was on the lesser end when it came to the outcry over its differences from the original. It was very well received in reviews from both critics and fans, sold really well, and is still highly regarded by most people over a year later. It was, however, also the game that indirectly kicked the soul versus soulless terminology into high gear. While I'm certain that phrase was used many times in the past when speaking about video games or even other forms of media, it really felt like soul versus soulless became a lot more widespread as a result of this video by Crobycat. A video that mostly just boils down to putting side-by-side comparisons of scenes and visuals from the original and remake and implying the original was better. Even if, like I mentioned earlier, it's something as minuscule as the lighting in a scene being different. I want you to make note of that last little word there. Different. It's gonna come back up. Now, in truth, this video was something that probably wasn't too unexpected to exist in some form. Resident Evil 4 is one of the most beloved and universally praised games of all time, to the point it's up there alongside titles like Metroid Prime, Mario Galaxy, and Chrono Trigger, to where it's absurdly rare to hear even a single bad thing said about it. So doing a remake was always going to have some people scratch their heads and not be as satisfied when Capcom inevitably made changes and alterations to the original. Hell, merely the idea of an RE4 remake in the first place had people wonder if it was even really necessary, and I'll fully admit I was in that camp. But once people got it in their hands, it became very clear just how much love, attention, and care Capcom had put into this game, not only making it a fantastic game on its own merits, but also reworking the vibe and style of RE4 without totally abandoning it. However, the fact that it was reworked at all is enough for some people to turn against the remake. See, when people shout soul versus soulless when looking at a remake, I feel like the underlying core of this take is that it has any differences at all from the original work. And because the person in question loves the original work, therefore, the remake is inferior. Because remakes will always have some alterations due to working with different tech, staff, and standards from when the game was originally made, you'll pretty much never get a remake that is completely one-to-one like the original except shined up. That's more in the territory of remasters. As a result, you will get things like different lighting, scene direction, voice lines, etc. And I think a big problem is so many people aren't actually judging these aspects on their own merits, but mostly by comparing them to the original. And if the person in question has a very deep attachment to the original, there's a very high chance they won't like it just on the basis that it's different and use this repeated phrase. Now, I don't think there's any problem with having a preference towards the original, especially if you're nostalgic for it. That's a powerful drug. But to call something as well crafted as Resident Evil 4 Remake soulless just reeks of bias and ignorance. This game isn't lacking a soul just because it's been updated and altered from how the original was 20 years ago. It builds its own unique and distinctive take very well, and to many younger gamers who will grow up with this version of the game, it will mean something special to them just as much as the original was to anyone back in the early 2000s who are now throwing out these comments. This is just a pill I think most nostalgic-driven gamers have to learn to swallow when it comes to large-scale remakes. They are by nature going to change aspects from the original, both minor and major. You aren't going to get the exact same game again, and in many ways it's best to judge the game by its own merits rather than just completely holding it up to the original. It's going to naturally draw some comparisons, of course, I won't deny that, but it does feel unfair to only hold it up side by side and not look at the remake on its own. And this only gets more complicated depending on the game in question. Because in the case of RE4, you have a game that's heralded as damn near perfect, so any alterations will on some level understandably come into question. It gets more complex when you're dealing with deeply flawed games that get remakes like Persona 3, which... Yeah, I guess it's time to open that can of worms. Persona 3 is the other remake that got me on this topic, and it is not only the one I feel strongest about in this whole discussion, but is also the most recent game at the time of making this video to be slapped with the label. So, after many years of fans calling for it for a variety of reasons, Persona 3 finally received a remake in early 2024, dubbed Persona 3 Reload, and overall the reception to it was very positive. Critics loved it, it became the fastest selling Atlas game of all time, and it got tons of praise from YouTubers and first-time players of Persona 3. However, a few months after release, things started to shift a little bit, with many chunks of the larger Megaten community throwing vocal outcry towards this game, claiming things that ranged from Reload missing the point of Persona 3 to such harsh extremes that could go as far as calling Reload the worst version of Persona 3.
Oh, wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Now, if it's not obvious already, I do not share that opinion. Not even a little bit.
No!
I think Reload is by far the best version of Persona 3 and is an astronomical improvement on the original game, and I know I'm far from alone in that. See, unlike RE4, Persona 3 isn't exactly considered this universal masterpiece. In fact, far from it. P3 has a dedicated following for sure, but it also has received a large amount of criticism over the years for very glaring design flaws that held the game back, especially when compared in retrospect to Persona 4 and 5. This was one of the main reasons why many people wanted a remake, to improve upon the intriguing yet fractured foundation of P3. And to many, including myself, Reload did exactly that. However, once again, due to inevitable differences, Reload changed aspects of the original game and people got unhappy about it. Reload took a lot of notes from Persona 5 in terms of its gameplay and style updates, which only makes sense as 5 is by far the most popular game in the franchise and what propelled it into the mainstream. So now Persona 3 has a general flow and presentation much more like its successors, which to many makes it much more accessible, but fans of the original now counter that by saying Persona 3 lost its identity or lost its soul. Despite the fact that Reload very clearly has a ton of effort put into its presentation and style and is very appealing to a wide amount of people. Again, I feel I need to stress this. Difference does not equal bad. And as I had previously mentioned, this is on top of all the improvements Reload made to Persona 3 to actually make it a fun game to play instead of a searing pain in the nutsack the original often was to a lot of people. Much like RE4, I want to make it clear I have no issue with people having a preference towards the original. You are completely entitled to that opinion. But to claim that this remake has no soul or to actively denounce it as the worst version of Persona 3, I simply cannot agree with that on any level. How in any metric someone can look at this game and go to a gamer with modern sensibilities and say, yes, you should play the version with no controllable party members, the tired mechanic, the jealousy mechanic, no selectable persona skills, no voice-acted social links, worse designed Tartarus, slower overall game speed, no expanded lore for side characters, no linked episodes for the male party members, and overall quality of life improvements that just naturally come with comparing a 2020s RPG to a 2000s one. Because you prefer the original soundtrack, or the lighting in the dorms, or the 2000s embodiment of Ow the Edge. Yet, see what I mean here? The original designs of these games will always be held close to the hearts of people who played them back in the day, but changes and alterations shouldn't be immediately lambasted just because it's not exactly like how your childhood remembers it. There isn't a lack of soul in these games, it's a twist on that soul with a unique flair, and that should be taken for what it is rather than what it's not. I just cannot vibe with this idea that these remakes are lazy or soulless when anyone with working eyes could tell a shitload of love and attention was put into them. And in a way that new, younger gamers could find themselves connecting to it in a way that's different from how the older gamers could. Now, I will make mention one argument that somewhat echoes around these discussions, and that's fans of the original not wanting the remake to just be viewed as a replacement for the OG and leaving it behind for the new and shiny version. This is a viewpoint I can sympathize with a little more, at least to some extent. It's understandable that someone who connected with the original work wouldn't want it to be simply viewed as an outdated relic that should be abandoned to time. Hell, from an artistic standpoint, this is very fair, as art should never be left behind just because of its age. However, I also think there's merit in remakes improving upon the original work because it can allow knowledge on game design to be applied retroactively to either improve upon a flawed piece or to open up new avenues for that same art to be explored in ways it didn't have access to during its time. Resident Evil 4 is such a hallmark title that there is no doubt it will continue on and be praised after the remake. Hell, Capcom is probably planning on a port of it to the Switch 2 as we speak. The remake just allowed for a distinct take on the same foundation, leaning into a more outright horror aspect than the more campy B-movie feel of the 2005 game. It's updated while also not alienating the prior work. And for Persona 3, while the PS2 version no doubt still holds value, we now have a version that is far more approachable and crafted with modern sensibilities, so it can attract millions of new fans in a way any previous version just never could due to their questionable design or limitations. You could still vouch for the past iterations due to their own distinct aspects, but if you want to introduce someone to Persona with a game that can show them the best of what the series can do without potentially driving them away due to its more unwelcoming design, there's really no other way to go. Cases of this most certainly vary from remake to remake. Like, it's very tough to recommend playing the original Metroid for any reason other than historical purposes, cause, Zero Mission's right there. But even then, there will almost never be an instance where a remake completely overshadows an original work to where it will have no value. And if the basis for some of these complaints is that remakes somehow disrespect art by trying to change it, well, remakes are art too, and can be lauded just as much. The Thing and Scarface, two of the most acclaimed films of all time, those are remakes. I bet a lot of you didn't even know that. But despite that fact, they're still seen as some of the highest pinnacles of filmmaking, remake or otherwise. This topic will always have some heat to it due to a lot of it tapping on nostalgia, personal perspective, and the value of art. But for my taste, remakes deserve just as much respect as any other game or piece of art that clearly puts in the work to be great. They're neither soulless nor lazy just on their premise alone, and anyone who wants to treat this medium as an art form can realize that. So, for my money, keep remakes coming, cause they've got more than enough soul for me. Especially if any of them in the near future include this, or this. Please!